Henry Madsen was a man who lived in a small cottage on the edge of a quiet countryside town. The house stood at the end of a narrow road surrounded by tall trees and open fields. It wasn't a big house. In fact, it was small and simple. One bedroom, a kitchen, a living room with an old armchair, and a front porch where he often sat alone. The paint on the walls had faded with time, and the wooden fence around the garden leaned slightly to one side. But for Henry, it was home. It was safe. It was enough. For 40 years, Henry had lived a life that many would call ordinary. Some might even call it lonely. He woke up early every morning before the sun rose, made himself a cup of black coffee, and sat by the window as the first light touched the fields. Birds would gather near his fence, and he always sprinkled breadcrumbs for them. That was the start of his day, every single day without change. Henry worked as a repairman in the nearby town. People knew him as a quiet man who always did his work properly and never complained. If something was broken, a chair, a leaky pipe, a loose window, Henry would fix it with patience and care. He didn't talk much, but he always smiled politely when someone greeted him. Everyone trusted him, but very few really knew him. In his entire life, no woman had ever stepped through the door of his house. It wasn't because Henry disliked people. It was simply because he had built a wall around himself, a wall made of habits, silence, and the comfort of being alone. He had never dated anyone. He had never been in love. While other men in the town got married, had children, and built families, Henry quietly watched from the side. He never complained. He simply believed that such things were not meant for him. As a boy, Henry had been shy. He was the one who sat at the back of the classroom, listening but never raising his hand. He liked drawing small sketches of houses, trees, and birds in the corners of his notebooks. When other children ran around laughing and playing, Henry preferred sitting under a tree with a book. He wasn't unfriendly, he just didn't know how to start a conversation. That quietness stayed with him as he grew older. When Henry turned 18, his parents passed away within a short time of each other, leaving him the little cottage he had grown up in. While many people would have moved to the city to chase dreams, Henry stayed. The house became his world. The walls held his memories, and the silence became his closest friend. He fixed the roof himself, painted the walls every few years, and planted roses by the fence. It was a simple life, but it was the only one he knew. Neighbors sometimes invited him to gatherings, birthday parties, weddings, summer fairs, but he always found a quiet excuse. He didn't dislike those events. He just felt out of place among laughter and chatter. He felt like an observer, not a participant. With time, invitations grew less frequent. People accepted him as the quiet man who keeps to himself. As the years passed, the world outside changed. New houses were built, cars became faster, people moved away, and new families moved in. But Henry's little cottage remained the same, like a photograph that time forgot. He still took his daily walk to the bakery every morning, greeted the shopkeeper with a polite nod, and returned home with a loaf of warm bread. On Sundays, he polished the wooden floors and watered the flowers in his garden. Every evening, he sat on his porch with a cup of tea and watched the sun melt into the horizon. Sometimes, when the night was quiet and the stars were bright, Henry felt a small emptiness inside him, a gentle ache he didn't talk about. It wasn't sharp or loud. It was soft like a whisper. It reminded him that while he had built a life of peace, he had also built it alone. He had no one to share his tea with, no voice in the house except his own, and no footsteps echoing beside his. But Henry never let the sadness grow too big. He would simply close his eyes, breathe slowly, and remind himself that some people are just meant to walk through life quietly. The townspeople, especially the older ones, sometimes spoke kindly about Henry. They admired his honesty and calm nature. "He's a good man," they would say, "just not the talkative kind." Young people found him mysterious. He rarely spoke about his past. Nobody ever saw him with a woman, not even once. Rumors started, as they often do in small towns, but they were never cruel. People didn't see him as strange. They simply saw him as a man who had chosen a different kind of life. Inside his home, everything had its place. The books on the shelf were neatly lined, the armchair was always positioned the same way, facing the window, and the teacups were arranged in order of size. Henry liked routine. Routine made him feel safe. It was like walking on a familiar path where nothing unexpected could jump out. He didn't like surprises. He didn't like change. And most of all, he didn't like opening his door to strangers. But even a quiet life can be interrupted in ways no one expects. On certain evenings, when the wind was strong and the trees swayed, Henry sometimes imagined what it might feel like to have someone sitting beside him. Not necessarily talking, just being there. A soft presence, a shared silence, a second cup on the table. He never admitted these thoughts to anyone, not even to himself out loud, but they existed in the corners of his heart like a small, secret wish. The world outside his door was full of noise, cars, laughter, music, the sound of people living their lives together. Inside, there was only the ticking of the clock on the wall and the faint hum of the wind through the windows. And for 40 years, Henry believed that was how it would always be. Some nights he would walk to the edge of the fields where the grass grew tall and the sky stretched endlessly. He liked the feeling of space, the fresh air, and the cool breeze on his face. It reminded him that even though he lived alone, the world was still big and alive. He would stand there for a long time, hands in his pockets, looking at the stars. Then slowly he would walk back home, lock the door, and fall asleep to the quiet. Henry wasn't unhappy. That's what made his story unique. He wasn't someone crying every night or dreaming of a grand romance. He had simply accepted his life as it was. But deep inside, without even fully knowing it, he carried a silent hope that something or someone might one day knock on his door. Not because he was searching, but because some part of him still believed that even quiet lives can have unexpected chapters. It was a calm autumn evening when the air smelled of rain and the sky was painted in soft gray. Henry sat by the window with a cup of tea, watching the leaves fall gently to the ground. The world felt peaceful, the same peacefulness it had carried for 4 decades. If someone had told him that everything would change soon, he wouldn't have believed it. The clock on the wall ticked softly. A faint breeze moved the curtains. In that moment, Henry was simply Henry, a quiet man in a quiet house, unaware that a story was about to begin. He didn't know that somewhere on the road nearby, a woman was walking in the rain, lost and cold. He didn't know that a single knock on his door would soon break the silence he had built around himself for 40 long years. He didn't know that a stranger would bring warmth into a house that had forgotten what warmth felt like. For now, Henry simply sipped his tea, closed his eyes, and let the stillness hold him. The world was silent, but not for long. The rain began slowly, like a quiet whisper on the roof. It tapped gently on the window panes as the wind moved through the trees, carrying with it the cool scent of wet earth. Henry sat in his armchair with his cup of tea resting on a small table beside him. He liked nights like this, calm, quiet, and far away from the busy world. It was a kind of silence that felt safe, but this night was different. The air felt heavier, as if the world was holding its breath. Clouds covered the moon, and the road outside his house disappeared into the darkness. The sound of the rain grew louder, filling the night like a soft drum. Henry closed his book and listened. There was something comforting about rain, but also something that reminded him how alone he was. When it rained this hard, the road outside was empty. No cars passed by. No voices echoed. It was just him, the rain, and the ticking clock. He rose slowly from his chair and walked toward the window. Water streaked down the glass, and through the blurry sheet of rain, he could barely make out the outline of the trees. Lightning flashed far away in the sky, followed by the low sound of thunder that rolled like a distant drum. Henry sighed and checked the locks on the door out of habit. He had lived alone for so long that little routines like this became part of who he was. Locking the door gave him a sense of safety. In all those years, nobody had ever knocked at his door at night. Not once. But then something happened that Henry would never forget. A sudden noise cut through the sound of the rain. At first it was faint, so soft that he thought he imagined it. He paused, holding his breath. The rain kept falling steady and strong. Then the sound came again, this time clearer. A knock. Henry froze. His heart gave a small, surprised beat. Another knock. It wasn't loud or rough, just a desperate, trembling sound of someone asking for help. For a moment, Henry stood completely still, listening. This had never happened before. Not in 40 years. His cottage was far from the main road. No one ever came here without a reason. His mind raced through possibilities. Could it be a lost traveler? Could it be one of the neighbors? But none of them had ever come to his door this late. The knock came again, this time a little stronger, as if whoever was outside was running out of hope. Henry walked slowly toward the door. His hands felt slightly cold, and he wasn't sure if it was because of the chilly air or the sudden rush of nerves. He stopped just a few steps away, listening carefully. The wind howled softly through the trees. Rainwater dripped from the roof. Then came a voice, a soft, trembling voice. "Please, is anyone there? I need help." Henry's heart tightened. It was a woman's voice, fragile, cold, soaked in the sound of rain. For a moment, he didn't move. He wasn't used to voices in his home. He wasn't used to opening his door to anyone. It felt strange and unfamiliar and almost unreal. "Please," the voice said again. "I'm stuck out here. My car broke down. It's raining. I don't know where else to go." Henry took a deep breath. He didn't know why, but he could feel the fear in her voice. Not the kind of fear that comes from danger, but the kind that comes from being alone, helpless and cold in the middle of the night. With slow, careful steps, Henry reached for the handle of the door. His fingers hesitated for a moment. He wasn't just opening a door. He was breaking 40 years of quiet walls. The door creaked softly as he pulled it open. The wind rushed in, carrying the cold rain with it. Standing on the small porch was a woman. Her clothes were wet, her hair clung to her face, and she held her arms close to her body to keep warm. Her eyes were wide, frightened, and full of relief when she saw him. "I'm so sorry," she said quickly, her voice shaking. "My car broke down the road. I walked for a long time. I didn't know there was a house here. Please, can I stay inside just until the rain stops? I'm freezing." Henry didn't say anything for a few seconds. His heart was beating a little too fast. He had never seen anyone standing on his porch at night, especially not a stranger, and certainly not a woman. But he could see how cold and tired she was. Her hands were shaking, her lips slightly pale from the wind. She looked like someone who had been walking through the storm for too long. "Come inside," Henry finally said, his voice quiet but steady. The woman stepped in, and the warm air of the house wrapped around her. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, as if the simple feeling of warmth was the greatest relief in the world. Henry gently closed the door behind her. The sound of the rain was still loud outside, but in here it felt softer, distant like a world away. She stood near the door, dripping water onto the wooden floor. Henry quickly grabbed an old towel from a hook by the wall and handed it to her. "Thank you," she whispered, taking it with trembling hands. Henry didn't know what to say. His voice had grown used to silence over the years. He wasn't a man of many words, but something inside him told him this moment mattered. "There's a chair by the fire," he said softly. "You can warm up there." She gave him a grateful look, the kind that speaks louder than words. Slowly, she walked toward the small fireplace where Henry had kept a quiet fire burning. The warm glow touched her face, softening the exhaustion in her eyes. As she sat down, Henry took a step back, unsure of what to do next. He had never shared his space with anyone. His home had always been only his. Every sound, every corner, every shadow belonged to his quiet routines. And now there was someone else breathing in this space. The woman wrapped the towel around herself and held her hands close to the fire. She didn't speak at first. She just sat there, letting the warmth sink into her bones. Henry stood near the doorway, still trying to understand what was happening. "Thank you for letting me in," she finally said softly. Her voice was tired but kind. "I didn't know where else to go. I was so scared out there." Henry gave a small nod. "It's all right." The storm outside grew heavier. Raindrops hit the windows like tiny fingers tapping against the glass. The wind pushed against the door, but the little cottage stood strong, warm and steady. Henry looked at the woman again. She seemed to be around his age, maybe a little younger. Her clothes were simple, not fancy. She had a gentle face, tired but honest. He didn't know who she was or where she came from, but in that moment none of it mattered. "Would you like some tea?" Henry asked after a quiet pause. Her eyes lifted to his, surprised. "Yes, that would be nice. Thank you." He nodded and went to the small kitchen. His movements were careful, almost nervous. He had made tea thousands of times for himself, but this was different. It felt strange to pour hot water into 2 cups instead of 1. It felt like something quiet inside his life had shifted without warning. When he returned, she smiled weakly as he handed her the cup. She wrapped her hands around it, holding it close to her lips, letting the steam warm her face. "It's so warm," she whispered. Henry sat down on the chair across from her. The crackling of the fire filled the silence between them. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was gentle, like two people breathing in the same quiet room after escaping the cold outside. She looked around the house. It was simple but neat. The walls were painted a soft cream color. Shelves held old books, some well-read, others untouched. The floor was wooden, polished, and shining faintly in the light of the fire. "You live here alone?" she asked quietly. Henry nodded. "Yes. For how long?" "A long time." She didn't ask more. She could feel that his words carried a lifetime inside them. The sound of the rain grew louder, but inside everything felt warm. The woman slowly stopped shivering. Her shoulders relaxed and her breathing slowed. Henry didn't know why, but a strange calmness spread through him. It had been many years since anyone had sat in this room with him. He looked at her and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. A small spark of connection. Not big, not overwhelming, just quiet and real. Outside, the storm roared on, but inside that little cottage, two people sat in front of the fire, warming their hands and sharing a silence that felt less lonely than it used to. Henry didn't know it yet, but this moment, this simple act of opening a door, was going to change everything. The fire burned softly, filling the small room with a gentle glow. The woman sat wrapped in the towel, her wet clothes slowly drying in the warm air. Henry sat across from her with his cup of tea, not quite sure what to do with his hands. He was a man who lived in silence, and now there was someone sitting in the middle of that silence, someone who had entered his world without warning. For a while, neither of them spoke. The rain outside made a steady sound like soft hands drumming on the roof. The wind was still strong, but inside the house everything felt calm. The flames in the fireplace flickered and danced, casting warm light on their faces. The woman took a small sip of her tea. It was hot but comforting. She held the cup tightly, as if it were the only warm thing in the world. Then she looked at Henry, her eyes softer now than they were when she first knocked on his door. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't opened the door." Henry gave a small nod. "It's all right. Anyone would have done the same." But she shook her head slowly. "Not everyone opens their door to strangers at night. You did. That means something." Henry wasn't sure how to respond. He wasn't used to people saying kind things to him. For years, the only voice he usually heard in the house was his own, and it was usually quiet. So instead of answering, he just looked into the fire. The warm light made the room feel smaller, almost like the world outside didn't exist. "My name is Claire," she said after a moment. Henry looked at her. "Claire?" he repeated slowly, letting the name sit gently on his tongue. It had been a long time since he had spoken someone else's name in his house. She smiled faintly. "Yes, Claire Bennett. I was driving home from visiting my sister. I took the wrong turn somewhere, and then the rain started. I thought I could keep driving, but then my car stopped working. I didn't know where to go. I just kept walking until I saw your house." Henry nodded slowly. "It's quiet out here. Not many people pass by." "I can see that," she said with a soft laugh. "I didn't even think anyone lived out here. I almost walked past the house, but the light in the window gave me hope." Henry glanced at the small lamp on the table. He had turned it on, as he always did in the evenings. He never thought much of it, but that small light had guided someone to his door. "I'm glad you saw it," he said quietly. Claire smiled again. It wasn't a big smile, just a soft one that reached her tired eyes. It was the kind of smile that carried gratitude. The room fell into silence again, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was a gentle silence, the kind that lets two people breathe in the same space without needing to fill it with words. Henry realized how rare it was for someone else to share this silence with him. Claire looked around the room slowly. Everything was simple and clean. She noticed the books on the shelves, the old photographs on the wall, the tools near the fireplace. It felt like a home that had been cared for with quiet hands. "You've lived here for a long time," she said softly. Henry nodded. "Yes, my whole life. You never moved?" He shook his head. "No." Claire tilted her head slightly. "Why?" Henry thought about it for a moment. He had never really explained his life to anyone. He didn't have anyone to explain it to. But something about this moment, this woman sitting by the fire, the sound of the rain, the soft way she looked at him, made him want to answer. "This house belonged to my parents," he said slowly. When they passed away, I stayed. I work in town, fixing things. This place has always been my home. Claire nodded gently as if she understood something without needing him to say more. She didn't judge him. She didn't make it sound strange. She just listened. Something no one had done for Henry in years. You must like it here, she said. Henry thought about that. I do. It's quiet, peaceful. Peaceful, she repeated softly. That sounds nice. But behind her calm smile, Henry saw something in her eyes. Something that looked a little bit like sadness. It was a small, quiet sadness that people carry inside them when they've walked through storms of their own. He didn't ask about it. He didn't need to. He simply saw it, and that was enough. Would you like to change into something dry? Henry asked gently. I can give you something warm to wear. She nodded quickly. If that's all right. Henry stood up and went to his bedroom. He opened the old wooden wardrobe and pulled out a thick wool sweater and a soft blanket. They were simple but warm. When he returned to the living room, Claire accepted them with a grateful smile. Thank you, she said again. Henry pointed to the small bathroom near the kitchen. You can change in there. A few minutes later, Claire returned wearing the oversized sweater. It hung loosely on her, the sleeves a little too long, but she didn't seem to mind. In fact, she seemed more at ease now. Her shoulders relaxed and her face no longer pale from the cold. She sat down again by the fire. This feels so much better, she said with a soft laugh. Henry nodded and sat back in his chair. It was strange. After 40 years of living alone, seeing someone in his sweater sitting by his fire felt almost unreal. But it wasn't uncomfortable. It felt warm, it felt human. Claire wrapped the blanket around her legs and stared into the fire. I live in the city, she said after a moment. It's noisy there. Cars, people, lights everywhere. Sometimes I forget what silence sounds like. Your house. It feels different. Like time moves slower here. Henry looked at her carefully. She was speaking with a softness that he rarely heard from anyone. I like the quiet, he said. I can see why, she replied. It's peaceful. It's the kind of place where a person can actually hear their own thoughts. For a long while they just sat like that, listening to the rain and the fire. Claire slowly opened up more, telling him small things about her life. She worked at a library in the city. She loved reading old books, but she rarely had time to read them because life kept her busy. She spoke about how sometimes she felt lost in the noise of everything around her. Henry listened. He didn't interrupt. He wasn't a man of many words, but he was a good listener, and Claire noticed. It made her feel safe to talk. In a strange way, this quiet man she had never met before made her feel heard. She also told him how she had recently gone through a hard time, not in detail, but just enough for Henry to understand that she was carrying pain. She said it in a way that didn't ask for pity. She said it like someone who had learned to keep going no matter what. I didn't plan on stopping here, she said with a small, tired smile. But maybe it's good that I did. Henry didn't know what to say, so he simply nodded. But inside he felt something warm grow, not just because of the fire, but because of her words. Hours passed slowly. The storm outside showed no sign of stopping, but neither of them seemed to mind anymore. Claire's wet shoes were near the fireplace, drying. Her car was somewhere down the road, but in that moment it felt far away, like it belonged to another world. Henry looked at the clock on the wall. It was late, far later than he usually stayed awake. But he didn't feel tired. It had been so many years since he had shared a night with someone, even just as company. He had forgotten what it felt like to talk, to listen, to have someone breathe in the same quiet space. Claire noticed the clock too. I didn't mean to keep you up so late, she said softly. Henry shook his head. It's all right. I don't mind. There was something honest in his voice, something gentle that made her heart feel a little lighter. Outside, the thunder rolled far away, and the rain slowly began to soften. But neither of them moved. It was as if time had slowed down inside that little house. Claire rested her head against the back of the chair. I can't remember the last time I felt this calm, she whispered. Henry looked at her carefully. The soft firelight touched her face, and she looked peaceful. Not the scared woman who had knocked on his door hours ago, but someone slowly finding warmth again. In that quiet moment, Henry realized something. For years, he had believed his life would stay the same forever, silent, simple, and untouched. But tonight, with just one knock on the door, something had changed. Not loudly, not dramatically, quietly, like a single candle lighting up a dark room. Claire closed her eyes for a brief second, listening to the rain. Henry watched her, not with curiosity, but with the quiet awareness of someone witnessing a moment he would remember for a long time. For the first time in 40 years, his house didn't feel empty. The storm continued, though it had softened into a steady rainfall. The thunder had rolled away to some far-off place, and only the gentle sound of raindrops tapping against the windows remained. The fire crackled softly, spreading a warm orange glow throughout the small living room. Henry sat in his chair, and Claire sat wrapped in the blanket, still wearing his oversized sweater. The clock ticked quietly on the wall, but neither of them seemed to care about time anymore. Henry's house had always felt like a place where hours stretched on endlessly, where nothing unexpected ever happened. But tonight was different. There was someone else here, breathing the same warm air, listening to the same rain. A stranger, yes, but also someone who didn't feel like a stranger anymore. Claire leaned a little closer to the fire. Her cheeks had gained color again, and her eyes didn't look as tired as before. The warmth of the room seemed to wrap around her like a gentle hug. She held her teacup in both hands and stared at the glowing flames as if they were telling her a quiet story. "It's strange," she said softly, breaking the silence. "I've been so busy for so long. I live surrounded by people every day, but I've never felt this kind of calm. It's quiet here, but it's a good quiet, a peaceful one." Henry looked at her from across the room. Her words touched something deep inside him. For years he had thought of his quiet life as something ordinary, something plain, perhaps even dull to others. But now hearing her say it felt peaceful made him see his world in a different way. "I like quiet," he said simply. "I can tell," Claire replied with a gentle smile. "It suits you." She turned her head slightly, her eyes meeting his. For a moment neither of them looked away. It wasn't an uncomfortable stare. It was warm, steady, like two people finally understanding something without needing to say it out loud. Henry wasn't used to being seen this way, not as the quiet man everyone passed by, but as a person with a story inside him. Claire rested the cup on the table beside her and leaned back against the chair. "You've lived alone all these years?" Henry nodded. "Yes, doesn't it ever feel too quiet?" Henry thought about it. "Sometimes, but it's the only way I know." Claire listened carefully. She didn't interrupt. She had already learned in the short time she had been there that Henry was not a man of many words. But every word he did say carried weight. It came from years of living in silence and thinking quietly. She lowered her gaze for a moment. "I used to think I loved the noise," she said softly. "The city, the people, the rush. But lately, I don't know. Everything just feels so loud. Even my own thoughts get lost in it. I don't even remember the last time I sat somewhere and listened to nothing." Henry didn't know what to say, but he understood. She wasn't just talking about the noise outside, she was talking about the noise inside her heart. "Sometimes silence can be kind," Henry said after a pause. "It lets you breathe." Claire nodded slowly. "Yes, it does." The rain outside made a soft rhythm against the roof. The fire cracked gently. The night had a stillness that wrapped around them both. It felt like the world had stopped moving just for a little while. Claire pulled the blanket tighter around herself. "Do you ever feel lonely?" she asked in a quiet voice. She didn't ask to make him sad. She asked because she truly wanted to understand. Henry didn't answer right away. He looked at the fire. For years he had lived with the kind of silence that others might call loneliness. But to him it had become familiar, like a shadow that followed but never hurt him. Still, he couldn't lie to himself. There were nights when the quiet became too heavy. Nights when he wished for a second voice, even if just for a moment. "Yes," he said softly. "Sometimes." Claire's eyes softened. "I do too," she whispered. "Even when I'm surrounded by people." "It's strange, isn't it? How you can be in a crowd and still feel alone." Henry nodded slowly. He had never been in crowds, but he understood the feeling she was talking about. Loneliness wasn't about how many people were around. It was about how deeply someone felt seen, or not seen. For the first time in years, Henry felt like someone was looking into the quiet corners of his heart. Not judging, not trying to change him, just seeing him. And it made something warm grow inside him, something gentle but powerful. Claire leaned her head back and closed her eyes for a moment. "When I was walking in the rain, I felt like the world had forgotten me," she said. "It was so dark. I was cold, wet, and tired. Then I saw the light in your window. I can't explain it, but it felt like the world whispered, 'Keep going.'" Henry stared at her quietly. He didn't realize that such a small thing, the warm glow of a lamp in the window, could mean so much to someone. "I'm glad you came," he said softly. Claire opened her eyes, surprised by the gentle honesty in his voice. A soft smile touched her lips. "I am too." Their conversation slowed, but it didn't fade. Instead, it became a quiet presence in the room, something unspoken but real. They both sat there feeling something they hadn't felt in a long time. Connection. Henry got up from his chair and walked to the kitchen. He wasn't used to having guests, but something inside him made him want to do small things for her, things that might make her feel safe and warm. He poured more hot water for tea and brought the kettle to the table. "You don't have to," Claire said softly. "I know," Henry replied, "but I want to." She accepted the cup and held it between her hands again. The warmth spread into her fingers and she exhaled slowly, as if she was finally able to relax after a long, tiring day. The wind outside had softened, and now the rain sounded like a quiet lullaby. The room was peaceful. Claire looked around once more, at the small bookshelves, the photographs, the carefully arranged furniture. She could tell this house held years of quiet stories. She wondered how many nights Henry had spent here alone, listening to this same rain, sitting in the same chair. "It's strange," she said softly. "I feel like I've known this place longer than just a few hours." Henry looked at her, surprised. "Why? Because it feels safe," she said. Henry had never thought of his house like that before. To him, it was just a place to exist. But hearing her say it made him see it differently. Safe. It was the first time anyone had said that to him about his home. "You can stay here until the rain stops," he said. Claire nodded slowly. "Thank you. I didn't expect any of this when I started driving earlier today, but I'm grateful." Henry sat back down and they both grew quiet again. But this silence was different from the silence Henry had known for 40 years. This silence was warm. It wasn't empty anymore. It was shared. Claire looked at the fire. "Do you know what I think?" she said suddenly. "Sometimes life brings people to each other at the strangest times. Not planned, not expected, just when it's meant to happen." Henry thought about that. He wasn't sure if he believed in things like fate or timing. But tonight, with the storm outside and this woman inside his house, it felt true. "Maybe," he said softly. Claire smiled. "Maybe." Time passed slowly, but neither of them wanted to rush it. They spoke a little more, sometimes about small things, sometimes about life itself, and sometimes they didn't speak at all. And that was just as good. Words weren't needed for everything. The fire burned lower, but it still gave warmth. Henry noticed Claire's eyes beginning to grow heavy. She had been through a long day walking in the rain, lost and cold. Now sitting here, she was finally at ease. "You should rest," Henry said gently. "You must be tired." Claire hesitated for a moment, but then she nodded. "Yes, I am. I'll bring you a pillow and blanket," he said. She tried to protest, but he waved it off. He went to his bedroom and came back with a soft pillow and an extra blanket. She settled on the couch near the fire, still wrapped in his sweater. The warmth of the room wrapped around her like a kind hand. As she lay down, she whispered, "Thank you, Henry, for everything." Henry didn't know how to answer at first. He had never been thanked like that before, not in a way that carried real feeling. He simply said, "You're welcome." Claire closed her eyes, and within minutes her breathing grew slow and calm. She had fallen asleep safe and warm, in a house that had once been only his. Henry sat quietly in his chair, listening to the rain, watching the fire burn low. Something inside him felt different. For the first time in 40 years, he didn't feel like just a quiet man in an empty house. Tonight he felt something soft, something alive, something he couldn't quite name. He looked at Claire sleeping peacefully on the couch and felt a warmth in his chest that no fire could ever give. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was gentle, steady, and real. The rain kept falling outside, but inside, Henry's world had quietly changed. The night passed slowly, wrapped in the soft sound of rain. The fire burned lower and lower. until only glowing embers remained in the fireplace. Henry sat in his chair watching Claire sleep on the couch. She was curled up under the blanket, her head resting on the pillow, her breathing calm and steady. Her hair, still slightly damp, framed her face softly. There was a kind of quiet peace in the way she slept, as if for the first time in a long while she felt safe. Henry had never shared his home with anyone before. For 40 long years this house had been silent, empty of voices other than his own. But tonight the silence was different. It wasn't lonely anymore. It was warm. It was filled with the soft sound of rain, the quiet breathing of another person, and the faint crackle of dying firewood. He leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. He didn't feel the usual heavy emptiness that often visited him in the night. Instead, he felt something lighter, something quiet but alive inside him. It was hard for him to name it. It wasn't excitement. It wasn't fear. It was a sense of gentle connection, something he had never allowed himself to feel before. For years, Henry had convinced himself that this kind of warmth belonged to other people. Not to him. But life, in its quiet way, had proven him wrong. All it took was one storm, one knock on the door, and everything had changed. Morning arrived slowly. The rain had stopped. Sunlight began to slip through the curtains, touching the walls of the small living room with a soft golden glow. The birds outside chirped lightly as if the storm had never happened. The air smelled fresh, like clean earth and blooming grass. Henry opened his eyes to the sound of gentle movement. Claire stirred on the couch, blinking against the sunlight. For a moment she looked a little confused, as if trying to remember where she was. But when she saw Henry sitting quietly in his chair, she relaxed. "Good morning," she said softly, her voice still a little sleepy. "Good morning," Henry replied. Claire sat up slowly, stretching her arms under the warm blanket. Her hair was messy from sleep, and she laughed softly when she noticed it. There was something different in her face that morning, something lighter. Maybe it was the rest. Maybe it was the warmth of safety she had felt through the night. "The rain stopped," she said, looking toward the window. Henry nodded. Yes, the room was bright now, filled with gentle light. For the first time in many years, Henry felt like the sunlight inside his house meant something more than just another day. It felt like a sign, a small, quiet beginning. "I must have fallen asleep quickly," Claire said. "I was so tired." "You needed the rest," Henry said kindly. She smiled at him, and there was a softness in her eyes that hadn't been there the night before. "Thank you again. For everything. You didn't even know me, but you let me in. You made me feel safe." Henry looked down for a second, a little shy from her words. It was the right thing to do. "Yes," she said gently. "But not everyone would have done it." Henry didn't know what to say, so he gave a small, quiet smile. That was the kind of man he was, simple, gentle, and not used to praise. Claire stood up and walked to the window. Outside, the world looked washed clean by the rain. The fields stretched far and wide, shining with dew. Birds flew across the open sky. Her car was still down the road somewhere. But for the first time since the night before, she didn't feel lost. "It's beautiful here," she whispered. Henry looked at her standing by the window in his oversized sweater, with sunlight on her face, and he felt a strange stillness in his chest. For 40 years this house had held only him, but this morning it felt different. It felt like it had opened a door, not just to the world, but to something inside him that had been quiet for too long. Claire turned to him with a soft smile. "I should probably go check on my car," she said. "I can call for help from the road if it's still not working." Henry nodded slowly. He knew this moment would come. He had known it from the start. She wasn't meant to stay forever. She was a traveler who had simply stopped at his door for one rainy night. But even so, the thought of her leaving made his heart feel strange, not painful but quiet in a new way. "I'll walk with you," he said. Her smile grew warmer. "I'd like that." Henry went to his room to put on his boots and coat. Claire folded the blanket neatly, the way someone does when they are grateful for what they've been given. She smoothed the couch, touched the edge of the chair, and looked around the room one last time. In just one night, this little cottage had gone from being a stranger's house to a place she would remember. They stepped outside together. The air was cool and fresh. The grass was wet beneath their shoes, and small puddles reflected the bright sky. The storm had passed completely, leaving behind only peace. They walked side by side down the quiet road, their steps soft on the wet earth. "I don't usually let people in," Henry said after a while. His voice was calm, but there was honesty in it. "I've lived alone for a long time." Claire glanced at him. "I know," she said softly. "I could feel that when I walked in. But you did let me in, and I'm grateful." Henry looked straight ahead, hands tucked into his coat pockets. He wasn't used to talking like this, but something about Claire made words easier. She didn't push. She didn't rush. She simply listened. "For many years," he continued, "I thought life would always be quiet. Just me. Just this house. I never expected someone to come." Claire smiled softly. "That's the thing about life. It surprises you when you least expect it." They walked in silence for a moment. The fields around them were green and shining, the kind of green that only comes after rain. A soft breeze moved through the trees, making the leaves dance lightly. The world felt fresh, like it was starting over. When they reached her car, it was still parked on the side of the road. The wet grass around it glistened in the sun. She pulled out her phone to call for roadside assistance. While she waited on the call, Henry stood nearby, looking at the road stretching far ahead. He had walked this road countless times, but today it looked different. It looked alive. "They said someone will be here soon," Claire said, slipping her phone back into her pocket. Henry nodded. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The morning air was filled with the sound of birds and the soft rustle of leaves. "Henry," Claire said softly. He turned to her. There was something kind and sincere in her eyes. "Last night meant more to me than you know," she said. "I was scared. I was tired. But you opened your door to me. You reminded me that kindness still exists." Henry felt something warm rise in his chest. He wasn't used to hearing words like these. For years he had lived quietly, helping people in small ways through his work, but no one had ever said something like that to him. "I'm glad you knocked," he said simply. She laughed softly. "Me too." The sound of a tow truck grew louder in the distance. Claire looked at Henry and gave him a warm, lasting smile, the kind of smile that stays in a person's memory long after goodbyes are said. "I don't know where life will take me next," she said, "but I'll never forget this night, and I'll never forget you." Henry felt his throat tighten slightly, but not in a sad way. It was a feeling he couldn't quite describe, something between gratitude and quiet hope. "I'll remember too," he said. The tow truck arrived, and a man stepped out to help with her car. Claire spoke to him briefly, then turned back to Henry. She took a small step closer, holding his gaze. "Take care of yourself, Henry," she said softly, "and don't keep your door closed forever." Henry didn't answer right away. Then slowly he gave a small nod. "I won't." She smiled one last time, then climbed into the truck. As the vehicle drove down the road, Henry stood there watching until it disappeared from view. The world grew quiet again, but it wasn't the same kind of quiet he had known before. It was brighter now, softer, warmer. He walked back to his house slowly, feeling each step like part of a new beginning. When he reached the front door, he paused for a moment and looked at it. The same door he had kept closed for 40 years. The same door she had knocked on. It didn't feel like just a door anymore. It felt like a story that had changed him. Inside, the house was still and calm, but it no longer felt empty. Her presence still lingered softly, in the folded blanket on the couch, the extra cup on the table, the warmth that hadn't faded yet. Henry sat down in his chair and looked out the window. The sun was shining. Birds were moving through the air like tiny dots of freedom. He thought about her words. Don't keep your door closed forever. He didn't know what the future would bring. He didn't expect grand things or big changes. But something inside him had opened, quietly, like a flower opening to the morning light. He realized that his life didn't have to stay exactly the same. It could still hold surprises. It could still hold connection. For the first time in many years, Henry smiled to himself without forcing it. It wasn't a big smile. It was soft and real. The world outside was quiet again. But this time the silence didn't feel heavy. It felt like a friend.